Hello everyone, back into today's first video. We're doing the 4th Spring 2020 Analogues update for today's first video. So, going to be a bit of a solar special this one. We're going to have a look at springs occurring around winters that are solar minimum winters. So essentially these are solar minimum springs, if you like. Some of them may be a little bit after true solar minimum, so the beginning, first spring of the new solar cycle is still being. Some of them may be just a little bit before, but in either case, these are basically solar minimum springs that we're going to be looking at for this 4th Analogues update, because we believe we are pretty much at solar minimum now for solar cycle number 24. So again, I'll get on with that for you very shortly. Just to say that the second video update coming up later on today will be the Sunday roundup. That's going to be around or just after lunch. And then, of course, we're also going to have a little update for the summer. Can you believe? Round 3, 4 o'clock this afternoon, there will be a little summer update. Just to let you know that we're nearing the time when we begin the countdown to the summer with the updates at GWV Spring. They really get underway in March, but we are getting a little bit closer to the summer updates now. So there'll be a little update for summer this afternoon. And then this evening got Ensemble's watch as well. So busy old day at GWV, and I hope you're going to enjoy all of the videos and all of the content. So I'll get on with the spring update for you very shortly. Just say it's quite a long video as always with the long range stuff. So can't watch it all in one go, but it will be at GWV.com indefinitely. On the spring updates page, there'll be a written summary that goes with the video, so you'll be able to watch the video on demand. Excuse me, and also have a read of that written summary. What else have I got to tell you? So I've got to say a big thank you to Analogues guru James Ackrill for getting all of our analogues together for us yet again. Thank you so much, James, for that. And also, of course, to Richard Trott for the spring updates GIF. Thank you, Richard, for the GIF. Right, so I think that's it. We better crack on. We've got a busy old day at GWV today, so let's get on with the 4th Spring 2020 update. So, as I said, we're going to look at solar activity for this one. So this is how the solar disk is currently looking on our side this day from solarham.net. Virtually a spotless solar disk. We have a couple of little sunspots there from solar cycle 24, which tells us we haven't probably started true solar cycle 25 yet, so we aren't at true solar minimum yet, but we're very, very close to it. Now, it is a little bit complicated to ascertain when you are at true solar minimum, and there is an overlap between solar cycles, so it's always a little bit difficult to ascertain when you are at true solar minimum, and that makes it particularly difficult in terms of winters. So sometimes it will be clear cut and you'll just have one true solar minimum winter. Other times you will kind of have two solar minimum winters. If solar minimum occurs in the middle of the year, let's say solar minimum occurs in July, then you will have a solar minimum winter before and a solar minimum winter after. You can see what I mean. So because winter is a season that's straddling 2 years, it is a little bit difficult to ascertain when true solar minimum occurs. So some of these analogues that you're going to see for these springs are following a single solar minimum winter. Others are following 2 solar minimum winters. It shouldn't make a great deal of difference to the overall outcome. So the first spring that we're looking at, which is nearest to a solar minimum winter, is the spring of 1843. Spring 1843 looks unsettled. It has below average heights coming in from off the Atlantic. It has a bit of a blocking seal up to the north, but it doesn't look like it would be a particularly cold spring. Actually, it just looks like it would probably be rather an unsettled spring, with low pressure heading in from off the Atlantic. Now, this solar minimum is one that encompasses 2 winters. So the next spring that is occurring nearest to a solar minimum winter is the following spring, 1844. So we've got 2 solar minimum winters going on here. The spring of 1844 has above average heights in the Atlantic and going to the north of the country as well, around Greenland, Iceland. Below average heights to the east and to the south. It's a rather blocked spring. It looks like it should be a relatively dry spring, this, with a lot of high pressure influences. Could be quite a cold spring though, possibly bringing in wind from sort of a north-northeasterly direction, so maybe quite cold and dry for the solar minimum spring of 1844. Our next spring occurring nearest to a solar minimum winter is the spring of 1856. This one looks a little bit colder. It has the above average heights sitting to the north. Below average heights are to the south of us. You would envisage we could be bringing in easterly winds quite a lot with that spring. Again, maybe relatively dry. The Atlantic is blocked off with jet stream pushed southwards, but there is wintry potential, especially early on, I would have thought, in the spring of 1856. And that's just a single solar minimum spring following a single solar minimum winter. Our next spring is 1867. Following a solar minimum winter. This one looks very, very unsettled. Atlantic unleashed big time in the spring of 1867. There's a small sort of northern blocking signal up to the north of us. But overall, it just looks really, really unsettled this spring. You can expect a lot of heavy rain. And, you know, really quite serious flooding potentially with that. It's a very, very unsettled spring indeed. The spring of 1867. Then we go through to the spring of 1879. Again, this spring is occurring nearest to a solar minimum winter. Essentially, it is a solar minimum spring. So this one has below average height centred over many central parts of Europe. It has above average heights out to the west and the northwest of the country. And with the jet stream, we're going to be doing something that's a little bit like that, perhaps. We're placed on the cold side of a jet stream, and of course 1879 is an exceptionally cold year. It's the last time we had a central England temperature into the 7s, so we haven't had a central England temperature for a year in the 7s since 1879. Exceptionally cold and severe winter from 1878, 1879, and then this spring is also a continuation of that. It's a very cold and wintry spring, as you can imagine, with high pressure being up here, low pressure there, and bringing the wind from the north-northeast. We're essentially continuing the pattern that we have through the winter, which is a very severely cold pattern. The next solar minimum winter was going to be 1889, 1890. So this is the solar minimum spring of 1890. This one is back to just generally unsettled weather, really. Below average heights covering much of Western Europe. Above average heights pushed out towards the east of Europe, a jet stream doing something a little bit like that. It's a very, very unsettled spring, this, in 1890. There's going to be lots of heavy rain associated with it. It's probably not all that cold. There's not much in the way of northern blocking to force cold air in. So I imagine it's a relatively mild spring, probably, but it could be a very, very wet spring indeed. Then we go through to 1902. So our next spring occurring nearest to a solar minimum winter is a spring of 1902. This one also looks unsettled. Definite trend, I think, here already for these springs to be unsettled. A little bit uncertain about temperatures. Not a particularly overly cold signal. The only very cold spring we've had so far, I think, is probably 1879, and that was a freak year. It's an abnormally cold year, even for the time, back in the latter part of the 19th century. But other than that, I don't think we have a trend particularly for temperature, but all of these springs, or most of them, have been looking very, very unsettled. This is another one of those, the spring of 1902, looking quite cold and quite unsettled too. Then we've got a double winter next. So this is the spring of 1913, the first spring that's occurring nearest to the first winter, nearest to solar minimum. This Spring in 1913, very, very unsettled, below average heights over and to the west of the country. We bring in the winds from the west, so yes, very, very unsettled spring in 1913. And the same is true for the spring of 1914. So we've got two winters there, the winter of 1912, 1913, and winter of 1913, 1914. Both of them are solar minimum winters. And this spring for 1914 is also unsettled, and it's westerly. So this was quite a mild spring. It's not a cold spring at all. It's actually quite a mild spring. But again, we see that signal for low pressure to be heading in from off the Atlantic during the spring of 1914. Next, we got the spring of 1923. This one, again, is unsettled with below average heights out to the west and to the southwest of the country, above average heights with this solar minimum spring up to the north. But I don't think it's particularly cold spring. This has been showing up a little bit actually within our analogues for the spring so far this year. The spring of 1923 does look like a mild and quite unsettled spring. This is another double solar minimum spring, winter and spring. So this one is 1924, also looking unsettled with below average heights coming in from off the Atlantic. Again, probably quite a mild spring, winds west-south westerly. There is a blocking signal, it's more over towards Canada. So it would be quite a cold spring for Canada, but for us, it doesn't look like it would be a particularly cold spring. But again, the main thing with this solar minimum spring is that it is looking unsettled. Now, this is a drier spring. This is 1933. Again, this one's been showing up a little bit in our package of analogues as well, this season so far, I think. So, this is the spring of 1933, again, occurring nearest to solar minimum winter. This one has a much more anticyclonic signal, above average heights extending from the north through the UK and to our south, below average heights out to the west and also across eastern parts of Europe. That looks like it's a drier and milder spring. The jet stream and the flow going to be doing something a bit like that. So a drier, milder, much more anticyclonic type spring for 1933. And then we go through to 1934, which is our next solar minimum winter and spring. So again, a double pair of solar minimum winters for this solar cycle, if you see what I mean, for 1932, 1933, and then also for winter 1933, 1934. And this is a completely different spring. Look at this, below average heights extending through west of Europe big time. So that's a very unsettled and wet spring in 1934. The next spring is 1944, occurring nearest to solar minimum winter, and this one has below average heights to the east of us. It has above average heights over and just to west of us. So this is a more anticyclonic signal. The only thing with this is we're probably bringing in the wind from the north-northwest quite a lot. So it's not necessarily a particularly mild spring, but at least there's quite a bit of dry weather on offer in the solar minimum spring of 1944. That's just a one-off as well for that solar minimum. So then we go through to the next solar minimum, which is going to be the solar minimum of 1954. This is how spring 1954 looks. Much more anticyclonic, above average heights to the north, but also extending to the northwest and to the northeast, below average heights to our south. And this, of course, brings in easterly winds. So this is a drier spring, again, high pressure sitting up to the northeast, but with winds coming in from the east, it's potentially a rather cold spring as well. Of course, we have a very late cold winter, the winter of 1953-54. Doesn't really start getting cold until February 1954, and that does carry over, particularly into the early part of the spring of 1954, I think. And then we go through to the solar minimum spring of 1965. This one is a cold and wet spring with below average heights to the east and to the northeast country, some blocking around Greenland and Iceland. So this one looks like quite a cold, unsettled spring. I think there's quite a bit of snow in March of 1965. And of course, it's setting up a path for a very, very cold summer as well. Summer of 1965 was a very poor summer indeed. Then we've got the spring of 1976, which is our next spring, occurring nearest to a solar minimum winter. This one has the above average height centred more or less over the top of the country, and also to the northeast and to the west. Low pressures up towards Greenland and Iceland. This is a dry spring, and becomes very warm by the time we get through to particularly May of 1976. We already see the hot summer beginning to get going, because there's a prolonged dry spell that begins at the end of 1974, doesn't break until the autumn of 76, and this spring is part of that prolonged dry spell. So plenty of dry weather and relatively warm in the spring of 1976. 1986 is our next spring. This one is cold and wet, with below average heights centred over and to the west of the country, above average heights pushed over to eastern parts of Europe. Jets doing something like that. So again, this is a cold, wet spring. There is some winteriness around, I think, during the spring of 1986, and more particularly just a very, very unsettled and wet spring in 1986. 1987 is much better though. So again, this is a double. This is a double pair of solar minimum winters and springs. So this one, the spring of 1987, has the above average heights extending from the Atlantic into the UK and up to northern parts of Europe. It has a cold and wintry March. You can see that wind would be in from the east quite a bit through this spring. So in March 1987, that's a cold and wintry month. But April 1987 is quite summer-like, actually. It's a very warm and mostly dry April. And then things begin to deteriorate in May 1987, and the summer of 1987 isn't very good at all. Spring 1996 is our next spring, occurring nearest to a solar minimum winter. This one very blocked, low pressure to our south, along with a jet stream as well. High pressure to our north, centred around Greenland, Iceland. Winds in from the east. So yes, this is a cold easterly spring. There's several snow events through March and April of 1996, and May, not much in way of snow, but May 1996 is a cold month with winds regularly from the north and from the northeast too. It's a continuation again of the pattern that we have through the winter, which is a very easterly winter. 95, 96 has a lot of easterly winds, and those easterly winds carry on into the spring of 1996. Relatively dry spring, but quite a cold spring. And then spring 1997, so again, this is a pair of solar minimum winters and springs. Spring 1997, anticyclonic. This time, though, you notice high pressure much further south, centred over the top of the country, below average heights away to the northeast and out to our west. And the flow of jets going something like that. This is a warm and dry spring, at least for March and April. A lot of warm, dry weather, and then May sees a flip, turns much cooler and much more unsettled in May 1997. And then the last pair of solar minimum winters and springs is going to be 2007, 2008, and the spring of 2008, and then 2008, 2009. And the spring of 2009. So, this is how the spring of 2008 looks. This is quite a cold spring, actually. It has above average heights centred up to our north around Greenland and Iceland, below average heights to our south, and we could well be pulling in winds from an east or northeasterly direction with the spring of 2008. In fact, we were at times. It has quite a wintry spell from kind of like the second half of March through the first half of April. So it's around 4 weeks when it does get really quite cold and wintry after an exceptionally mild winter as well, interestingly. So kind of late March to the early part of April, cold and wintry. Then April gradually starts to warm up, and May becomes very warm. Actually, May is the best month of the summer. A lot of warm and dry weather, and then the summer itself of 2008 well and truly goes down the tubes. And then finally, we've got the spring of 2009 occurring nearest to solar minimum winter. This one is a very mild spring indeed, with quite a bit of anticyclonic weather too. Below average heights up to the northwest. Winds coming in from west-southwesterly direction. So we have that very cold spell of weather, of course, during the first half of February 2009. But then when we get to the end of February 2009, we set up a much warmer and drier pattern, and that carries on then well into the spring. So March and through to April, we have a much warmer and drier type pattern in 2009. Quite a nice spring, that one. So that's it, putting all of those years and springs together. This is how all Marches combined are looking when springs are occurring nearest to solar minimum winters, and all Marches combined look unsettled, with below average heights centred over and slightly to the south of the country, some above average heights to the north, perhaps not as much as you might have expected though going through most analogues, and so there is a bit of wintry potential with these marches. Some of them, yes, could be quite cold, but I think the main takeaway, the main signal, is for these marches to potentially be unsettled and quite wet. All Aprils combined continues that as well. Again, there's a very slight northern blocking signal up to the north, but it is weak and it is reduced compared to what we have in March, which is already quite a weak signal. So overall, again, just bringing low pressure in from off the Atlantic into northern Europe, jet stream coming through pretty much the UK, so these Aprils look like they would be favouring very unsettled conditions indeed. Of course, we know there's a few years that deviate, and we can't rule out the chance that we would get a year that deviates for this April, for example. So we've got 1933 within this solar minimum analogues package, and that was a relatively warm and dry spring, as we established. So there are years that deviate, but overall, with all the springs together, it does look like solar minimum is a signal for April to be unsettled as well. And then this is how all Mays combined are looking. It doesn't get any better. In fact, it may even get a little bit worse, because the trough of low pressure seems to be deepening and centering just to our east. So these Mays definitely favouring very unsettled and quite cool conditions as well. All 3 spring months going to have appreciable spells of rain. And look at that. That is the overall spring analogues. All springs combined for springs that are occurring nearest to solar minimum winters, and it's definitely a very, very unsettled signal indeed, with low pressure unleashed big time coming in off the Atlantic. Yes, it looks like it's a very, very unsettled signal indeed. There is a slight northern blocking signal up to our north. There is some high pressure towards Greenland, but it's pretty much overpowered by what is just a very, very unsettled looking signal from the Atlantic into much of northern Europe. And so we don't think favour a notably cold spring with these solar minimum springs, but what we do favour is a very unsettled and potentially a very, very wet spring indeed. Of course, there are other factors that are important, so we can't take this on its own and say that's exactly how spring is going to be, or is very likely to be. There are all of the other factors that we've been looking at, such as the QBO, which is going to be transitioning into its easterly phase. We're going to look at ENSO as well before these updates are finished. So, yes, we can't just take that on its own and say we're going to have a really wet and unsettled spring. But it is a very, very strong signal, you have to say. It is a very strong signal indeed for this spring to be really unsettled. Of course, we've had a very unsettled autumn and winter as well. Is it just going to go on and on and on? Is there going to be no end to the Atlantic overpowering everything and sort of dumping his contents over the top of the heads of the UK? Well, we've got a little while to go yet before we release in the GWV spring forecast. We won't be doing that until the 1st of March. It's getting ever closer though, and we will soon have to start thinking about what that spring forecast is going to be. Right, so that's it for the spring 2020 Analogues update. Now, there's not going to be any spring updates next week because this is kind of like set that up, really, or set up what we're doing next week, because we're going to do Solar Sunday. Next week, we're going to have our first Solar Sunday since I think it was probably August time, maybe, but we did a Solar Sunday before. So yes, next week we've got Solar Sunday. It will be Solar Sunday at Gals Ovens. You only do 2 or 3 of those a year, so very special day at Gals Ovens next week. We'll update all of the trackers and bring you up to date with where we are with Solar Cycle 24. It could well be the last Solar Sunday of Solar Cycle 24, because I don't think it's going to be that long at all now before we move into Solar Cycle 25. So Solar Sunday coming up next week, which means no spring analogues. They'll be back in 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks today, we'll do the 5th spring 2020 analogues update. Come back later on for Gals Ovens Sunny Roundup, and also for that little update for the summer. And also, we'll have Ensembles Watch for you this evening. This video will be placed on the Spring 2020 updates page, and there'll be a written summary that goes with it sometime this evening. Not sure when I'll get it up for you, but I will get it up before the end of the day. That's all for now, though. So I'm going to be Sunny Roundup next. Come back for that just after lunch. That's all for now, though, and thanks for watching.